Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you and acknowledge firstly that I'm opening this event on the unceded sovereign lands of the Darug Nation. The Darug, like all indigenous nations on these lands, have been resisting colonization for over 238 years. I pay respect to their elders and acknowledge the presence of any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today for this webinar on hate, placing the Combating Antisemitism, Hate and Extremism Act in context. My name is Alana Lentin, and I'm a Jewish anti-Zionist European woman. I'm a professor of cultural and social analysis, and I research race and racial capitalism, racial regimes, anti-racism, and anti-Semitism. Today, I am here in my capacity as a member of the founding collective of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. Launched in 2023, the aim of the Institute is to build the field of critical Zionism studies, a political, ideological, and racial and gendered knowledge project that intersects with Palestine and decolonial studies and other areas of research. We hold events on and offline, host the Critical Zionism Studies Journal, working groups on various aspects of Zionism and its intersections, offer graduate student support and mentoring, and host the Unpacking Zionism podcast, and much more. So why did we decide to organize this webinar? This webinar is being brought together to provide some context grounded in research and activism for the Combating Antisemitism, Hate and Extremism Act passed by the Australian Parliament in January 2026. Many anti-racist groups and those working for Palestinian liberation have been concerned about what the new act will mean for them. For example, people have asked why there is a focus on anti-Semitism and why hate and extremism rather than racism and fascism, for example, are its focus. Critical Zionism studies works at the intersection with critical race theory and critical ethnic studies. Both have a long-standing critique of the limitations of equating racism with hate or prejudice. Critical approaches to race have stressed its systemic, institutional nature and its functioning through law, policy, and the operations of state, colonial, and imperial power. Much critical scholarly work has been done on the problems of couching racism in the terms of hate. The association of systems of power with beliefs or acts grounded in seemingly irrational hatred of other people individualizes systems and severs the racial project from what the sociologist Miri Song has called its history, severity, and power, from its grounding in European civilization and the technologies of colonial rule that continue to underpin the world system. Critics have also pointed out the limitations of carceral solutions for dealing with people accused of hate crimes, which by criminalizing individuals as uniquely hateful, mobilizes technologies of punishment against them while obscuring the context of colonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy, the structures of power that give rise to violent acts, which the notion of hate crimes isolates out of the ordinary rather than a feature of daily life for many people in racist cultures. The presentation of racism as hate, as our panelists will show, has also historically been associated with Zionist activism. In this context, anti-Semitism has been severed from its origins in European Christian thought and systems of racial rule and presented instead as an age-old and universal hatred, an ahistorical view that does not benefit a deeper understanding of the actual roots of anti-Semitism and the links between it and other forms of racism. Anti-Semitism, rather, is proposed from a Zionist standpoint as the prototype for all racism, which then is disconnected from systems and attached to individuals with detrimental effects for anti-racism and solidarity between oppressed groups. So here to discuss these issues in further detail, we have three experts. Unfortunately, Ewan Mann and founding president of the Black People's Union, Kieran Stewart Asherton, is unwell today and is unable to join us. And Professor Jesse Daniels also, unfortunately, has another commitment, but we're still delighted to have three fantastic speakers and more time for discussion. We will be using the chat function to ask questions, so please pose your questions in the chat and I'll be reading them out and posing them to the panelists at around 11 o'clock, leaving us half an hour for discussion. So to introduce the panelists, first up we have Emmaia Gelman, who is the director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism and the author of The Anti-Defamation League and the Racial State, which is coming out very shortly with UC Press. Following her, we have Dylan Rodriguez, who is a founding member of the founding collective of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, and a teacher, scholar, organizer, and collaborator in Black Study at UC Riverside and in the community. He also has an important book out soon, in addition to all of his other marvelous writings on, it's called Counterinsurgency Machine, and it's out soon with AK Press. Lastly, we have Ihab Shalbak, who is a lecturer in human rights and social justice at Sydney University. And he, of course, has written extensively on Palestine and human rights, and will be here, hopefully, to share some thoughts with us today about the issue of mandatory Zionism. So I'll be handing over to Emmaia to get us started. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be here with you. My name again is Emmaia Gelman, and I'm the director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. The idea of recognizing Zionism as a power structure, as an ideology, and actually as an epistemological regime is what we need to do to understand how it affects the ways that we think and speak. Meaning, not that it's like, a conspiracy of control, but that in fact power discourses and structures teach us what is important, teach us how to think, and then the language that we use reflects those structures. And so the idea of critical study, of course, is to consider how power is operating, not only in the sense that it produces our tangible conditions, but also in the sense that it shapes the frameworks through which we think about them, the frameworks that we accept about, what makes sense or what's important. And the discourse of hate is very much part of that, part of our sort of current governing epistemological framework. And researching the history of Zionist politics and Zionist efforts actually comes very clearly and non-controversially, I think, to the conclusion that the framework of hate itself was generated by Zionist organizations in the service of their political interests in Zionism. Not only Zionism, and it's not only Zionist organizations that have worked on it, and it's not only in the interests of Zionism, but I want to go into the history a little bit and explain. To do that, we have to start by recognizing that the hate discourse that is now at least circulating throughout the West, if not globally, emanates from the United States. And it emanates from a particular moment in history that I'll talk about as well. It has been exported largely through movements that have conceived of rights and the pursuit of rights through the colonial and liberal state framework. And often, very often, it's LGBTQ rights and Jewish rights. And just, to situate myself so that Sky News doesn't have to worry that I'm a conspiracy theorist, I am a queer Jew. So I'm talking about the frameworks that have been extended to me, right? Offered to me as ways that I might pursue my rights if I am willing to ignore all of the other frameworks, all of the other kinds of power that I have to invoke and exert over other people in order to do that. Where advocates for communities of color, for indigenous communities, for queer communities have adopted it outside of the United States and inside the United States, the move to label the kinds of violence that we experience hate has been a very rational and understandable effort to draw recognition to the kind of violence that we experience that's not acknowledged, right? So in societies where racism is not acknowledged as a form of violence and anti-Indigenous violence is not recognized, anti-immigrant, anti-queer violence, right, that the state has ignored, the hate framework offers an invitation for how can you be recognized? And actually the history in the United States of the the legislative hearings that produced hate crimes policy were actually, it was like a 10-year litany. Everybody needed their hearing. The Asian community wanted a hearing on anti-Asian hate because anti-Asian violence had not been recognized. Indigenous communities wanted a hearing on anti-Indigenous hate because anti-Indigenous violence had not been recognized. So it becomes very clear that that the discourse of hate becomes an invitation for those who are quite desperate to intervene in violence to find their way into an alignment with the state, which turns out to be a form of erasure. As Alana mentioned, in the cases where that has been adopted, where hate has become the way to talk about something like racial violence or anti-Indigenous violence, it has sidelined and replaced the understandings of violence in which the state is implicated. So, for example, police violence, right? Police violence in the United States, I'll use the context that I know, police violence accounts for an enormous amount of racial violence, but it's not classed as hate. And so when we count hate crimes, we're not talking about like every time a police car pulls out of a precinct, but we should, right? But it doesn't count because state violence is not considered. It also individualizes violence. It looks only at violence between individuals and people. It strips out the power relations between them. So, for example, if I open a gentrifying coffee shop in a Black neighborhood where Black families are being forced out of the homes that have been, anchored their community for however many decades, and someone spray paints on my coffee shop, like white gentrifier, get out, that becomes equated with the same as if it were the same as if I, as a white person, spray painted on a Black-owned coffee shop, Black people get out. And we know those are not the same because the power that's involved and the domination that's involved in each is very much not the same. But the language of hate equates them. And that's really the conservative project that we find. And I promise I'm gonna get to the history in 1 second. When we can't see power, acts of resistance to violence, to that kind of violence, they look irrational, right? So, and in the very present context, a reaction to genocide and colonialism that targets somebody who represents that, whether justly or unjustly, right, becomes recast as if it's irrational, when in fact, we know it's not irrational. It may be misdirected, but it's not irrational. And it's not hatred on the basis of religion. It's hatred on the basis of animosity on the basis of the experience of violence. So let me begin there to look at the history itself. I borrow here from the work of sociologists Valerie Janis and Rai Kangrattat, also queer theorist, queer legal critical scholar Dean Spade, and community organizer and theorist Kay Whitlock. There's a lot of people who have worked on hate as well. These are just some of the formative literature that have really helped me understand this. To look at hate as a social problem, which is what the hate crimes framework does. It says, like, we have a problem, people are, hurting each other. The problem, the way that we're going to define why people are hurting each other or, attacking each other is that they hate each other. And then we're going to develop a series of policies to address hate, right? Like, that's defining hate as a subject of policy and a social problem. It happens in the United States in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's not that people weren't using the word hate before that. They certainly were, but it wasn't a subject of policy. What was happening in the United States in the 1980s and 90s? Two very different things. One was that we were in the sort of aftermath of a movement, of a rich and challenging movement that had emerged through even the 50s, but the 60s and 70s in the United States, that had gathered communities of color and queer communities as advocates and political actors. And there was a backlash of racism and homophobia and also other forms of attack, ableism, that was exacerbated and escalated by the rise of white nationalism as soldiers returned from the Vietnam War. This is a lot of confluences. Maybe we don't have to hold all of this in our heads, but the important thing to understand was that there was a white nationalist violence, really extraordinary and spectacular, like showy violence against people of color, Indigenous people, immigrants, queers, and other marginalized groups. It was also, as the AIDS crisis escalated, that violence also turned against people with AIDS. At the same time, it was the Reagan era, right? There was a rising conservatism, an effort to reimpose cultural discipline, to sort of stuff the counterculture movements back in the box, um, and to especially to attack Black Power, which was trying to instantiate the sort of ethos of the civil rights movement, but in a more meaningful way than simply formal equality. Um, so there were competing forces between the idea of fighting fighting racism and challenging the sort of colonial and old liberal societal ways of the United States, and these movements that were trying to resist it and really change it. And that contention erupted in white nationalist violence. But the people who were trying to solve the problem, meaning the idea of calling on the police to intervene in violence and calling on legislators to intervene in violence, were also interested in conservatism, right? Interested in the state, interested in law and order and regulation. And one of the pieces of that sort of conservative structure was a Zionist movement. Now, the Anti-Defamation League, which is the subject of my study, not because I love the Anti-Defamation League, but because it's sort of a really emblematic institution of the Zionist infrastructure, and studying the Anti-Defamation shows often how Zionism has been working. The Anti-Defamation League recognized at that point in time, around the mid-70s, that the anti-Semitism that it had sort of claimed to be about addressing, it was always a conservative organization, but it claimed a sort of place in the fight against anti-Semitism, particularly coming out of the Nazi Holocaust, coming out of World War II. The Anti-Defamation League recognized that that form of anti-Semitism was over. That's not my assessment. That's the Anti-Defamation League's assessment. And at the same time that the left, student movements and the anti-war movement and the Black Power movement were recognizing Zionism as a form of colonialism. All of the ideas that that Zionism was a liberation movement and that it was a refuge for Holocaust survivors, that had shored up Zionism among progressive movements until then, had fallen away, essentially. And they were very concerned about how are they going to reestablish the demand to support Zionism and the State of Israel as a moral imperative. And so in the mid-70s, they literally wrote a book called The New Anti-Semitism, in which the ADL said, now that Jews in the United States are part of the establishment, this is also their terminology, these leftist movements that are fighting the establishment are actually fighting Jewish interests, and they're anti-Semitic. To me, that's like the most anti-Semitic thing they could have ever possibly written, but that is what they wrote. It was specifically calibrated as a way to attack the New Left, and very specifically the fact that there were lots of Jews in the New Left who were also opposing Zionism. They weren't members of organizations because Jewish organizations had thrown them out already. But they were a strong and rising force, and the ADL named them as a threat. So they created this idea of the new anti-Semitism. They created all kinds of other kind of mechanisms around it. This is the period of time where the Anti-Defamation League started counting anti-Semitic incidents to create data that could be sort of held up like, well, let's not talk about the fact that, Black families and communities have been sort of shoved into inner cities and abandoned there, and the police are, policing them, and there's a war on drugs. Let's talk about the number of incidents that has affected Jews in the United States. What are those incidents? Well, some of them might be like somebody drew a swastika, in the sand on the beach, and then maybe also like a synagogue had its windows broken. But those events are conflated, and they're turned into numbers, which can then be used to sort of elevate a crisis. The ADL had also been trying to create legislation that escalated those tiny incidents, those small incidents, like somebody draws a swastika on a school desk, to a crime. And their rationale for it was that it portended worse, right? Like we're always on the verge of another Nazi Holocaust, right? Yes, that incident was small and didn't really do anything, but like if we don't criminalize it, then we might miss when it does come. So it was a very sort of fear and panic based effort. And those efforts had been refused over and over again in the courts. But when anti-Black violence became a crisis and anti-immigrant violence became a crisis, and those communities started seeking efforts to legislate not only harsher penalties, but requirements that police intervene, because the police and the Department of Justice in the Reagan era did not have any interest in intervening. When legislative advocacy arose to try and address that violence, the Anti-Defamation League saw correctly the opportunity to merge its efforts to criminalize small symbolic acts with efforts by Black and immigrant communities, and actually queer communities as well, to create new penalties for acts of violence, like the catastrophic acts of violence. And just to be clear, I'm talking about like people being set on fire, right? Like people being shot in the street, people having messages carved into their bodies, right? And these were catastrophic acts. It's not strange that people were trying to pass laws to require the state to intervene. But the ADL saw that opportunity to merge the two things, and it did so under the banner of hate crimes. And over the course of the 1980s, the Anti-Defamation League became the leader of that effort, not because it was allied necessarily with the interests of the other groups that were doing it, but because it had the power. It had the legislative access, it had the money to run campaigns, it had the standing. And part of the reason it had the standing is because it was also a conservative organization, much in the way that when a government has to deal with racist incidents, it would much prefer to listen to a white organization talk about how to do it than to listen to an organization that comes out of a low-income, Black community that's confronting policing all the time. And so we ended up with a hate crimes framework that was actually incredibly successful in seeding the idea of hate as the problem, not racism, not racist violence, right? Not white nationalism, not capitalism or war as the drivers of that, but just sort of interpersonal hate, really, really narrowing it and making it quite small. And at the same time, it really differentiated what it was calling hate from what it wanted to call political violence. And what did it want to call political violence? Violence against Arab Americans. That was deemed political. And so we can see from that history of where it emerged and what kind of language was used around it, how it stripped away discourses of racial violence that had existed and exonerated the state and separated out the parts of violence that it didn't want to require the state to address. And it greatly empowered policing. The outcome of this is that hate crimes have been used by far and away to police people of color and queers more than they have been to police violence against them. I mean, we don't have to compare like carceral practice is carceral practice, but the if you want a sort of simple measure, hate crimes laws have been used to police the people that they're supposed to protect much more than not. And in the present, they have become a broad tool of the right to police political thought. So for example, the idea that people would oppose or protest the police has been recast as, like anti-blue hate. And in the course of the last 2.5 years, as the anti-genocide movement has risen. They've been used to criminalize protests. They've been used to criminalize the anti-genocide movement. They've been used to criminalize Palestinian and Jewish identities where the idea where protesting and opposing violence is integral to our sense of ourselves. I think the most important thing to understand about hate crimes laws is that because they play on the idea of racial justice or gender justice, they sort of speak the language of liberal rights. They have become a tool to recruit liberals, people who sort of see themselves as sympathetic, to fascism. That is really their primary function. And we see these really crass constructions of that, like in Germany and at least one U.S. university, where the people are put in charge of policing anti-Semitism who are not Jewish, and then the people that they're targeting as anti-Semites are Jewish, right? It's like couldn't be more obvious. And similarly, we get attacks like Sky News's attack on the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, calling us anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists. I presume that the person who said that didn't actually know anything about the Institute, but it's the idea that speaking against violence of a particular kind makes you hateful and therefore irrational. So I'm going to pause it there. That's a lot of information. I think it's really worth looking at the history of hate crimes to understand its emergence, in any one place. And the primary question to ask in order to understand that is simply, where is the state and who is this actually working for?
Thank you, Emmaia. That was really, really rich. Just an introduction, I think, to the extent of your work. One thing that I wanted to pick up on was what you said towards the end, that recruiting, that the effort here is really to recruit liberals, many of whom come in good faith, I think, for fascism. And I think that takeaway really crystallizes so many of the issues that you raised. Okay, we're going to now bring Dylan Rodriguez to the stage. So over to you, Dylan, and I will spotlight you if I work out how to do it. Here we go. Welcome, Dylan.
All right. Hey, so my gratitude, Alana, to Alana for inviting me to be part of the conversation. So let me just offer that what I want to contribute is in most ways very much complementary rather than foundational in this conversation. I have been politically and intellectually preoccupied, if not obsessed, with all of the technologies and logics of counterinsurgency warfare against radical and revolutionary movements, as well as abolitionist and anti-colonial movements that have unfolded over the last 25 to 30 years in ways that both include the state and, very importantly, exceed the state. So that's what I wanted to talk about and share with you all today, is the concept of lexical warfare. So I really just want to define the terms and begin to try to catalyze a conversation around the framework and around the archive that Emmaia has already begun to lay out, and that the rest of us, I think, will try to build on in the remaining discussion. So I want to be clear as I begin that what I understand as the theater of lexical warfare directly involves all of us. It involves everybody who has access to language and to the worlds that language shapes and destroys. So by way of background definition, a given linguistic community's lexicon, and Emmaia just touched on this in the tail end of your presentation, right? We're touching on how lexicons work. The lexicon of any given community is the changing collection of words and basic expressions that both reflect and produce a broadly shared social understanding and cultural knowledge. Now, we should be overt and clear with each other about the fact that oftentimes that broadly shared social understanding and cultural knowledge mandates the repression, political and otherwise, of particular other kinds of social understanding and cultural knowledge. That's why we are here. So the lexicon in this sense is an everyday form. It takes form as a combination of different meanings and terms, culturally specific terms, slang, figurative phrases, colloquialisms, implied meanings. The lexicon that one lives in allows one to make immediate contextual connections between specific words and larger categories and conceptual classes that give them meaning beyond narrow dictionary definitions. So this is what we mean by lexicon. The mental lexicon, the unspoken lexicon is, I think, something that we're really touching on today. As a couple linguists have written, the mental lexicon is flexible, extensible, and richly structured. It forms the context for the knowledge that speakers and hearers have about their everyday world, even as they may engage in political conflict over the meaning of certain contentious keywords within that lexicon. So in addition to our principal point of concern today, anti-Semitism, think as well about the terms democracy, freedom, gender, violence, equality, and safety, among many other terms. The point I'm making here at the outset is that symbols, words, metaphors all destroy, they humiliate, they demoralize, and they kill. Right? These things are indispensable and inseparable from warfare. Abstractions, fantasies, aesthetic orders are inseparable from the physical and physiological casualties that are created by conquest and genocide. And I'm talking in the long historical sense as well as the real-time sense. Perhaps most importantly for our purposes in this discussion, I want to analytically distinguish lexical warfare from the more commonly used notion of weaponized language. I think increasingly, if not seemingly universally, when we engage in critical discussions around the use of the term anti-Semitism as a primary leverage point of anti-Palestinian and anti-Palestinian liberationist solidarity repression, we often refer to it as a weaponization of the term. I think that is an insufficient framing. So let me explain more how. Here I want to think about the work of critical ethnic studies scholar and former Palestinian youth movement organizer Lubna Khatami, who was thinking alongside the poet, journalist, and Palestine studies scholar Omar Zaza, when they emphasize the historical stakes of the global canonization of a Zionist conception of the term anti-Semitism. Together, they situate the long-term formation of what I'm naming here as Zionist lexical warfare by reminding us of how, and I'm quoting them here, Palestinians in exile have vigilantly fought against discursive erasure and containment that prohibit any meaningful expression of the Palestinian experience in academic and popular discourse and renders their humanity illegible. So let that stay with you for just a moment, so we can understand how it is that there's a kind of lexical normalization of Palestinian evisceration that Khatami and Zaza are talking about here. Of course, I think many in this audience are probably already familiar with arguably the pinnacle contemporary example of counterinsurgency in the theater of lexical warfare, which is, of course, the definition of anti-Semitism developed in 2016 by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA. By way of brief introduction for any who are unfamiliar, and I also think it's worth just refreshing our memory as to how the IRA has defined anti-Semitism, it goes as follows, quote, "Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities." The definition moves on and it says, manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. There's multiple other idiosyncrasies and kind of examples that are provided by IRA in its definition. But here, what I want to emphasize is how IRA's construction of this term anti-Semitism clearly demonstrates how the policing of rhetoric, right, the field of rhetoric, how the policing of the field of rhetoric may prefigure and accompany militarized mobilizations of repression, including proto-genocidal and genocidal warfare against projected culprits, so-called anti-Semites. Operationally, IRA's definition constructs a theater of Zionist counterinsurgency warfare that is simultaneously discursive, as Khatami and Zaza put it, and material, as we have seen. And by the way, not just in the last 2.5 years, in the last almost 100 years. The operation of the normalized Zionist definition of anti-Semitism melts the distinction between symbolic and military violence, rhetorical policing, and genocidal to proto-genocidal mobilizations of colonial war. Now, we also have to be attentive to the operations of lexical warfare by way of, in this case, the various institutional adaptations of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And here, of course, for anyone that's even casually followed this story, national and local governments at every scale, public and private schooling institutions from K through 12 through prominent universities, public and private, various corporate and nonprofit organizations, media entities, their adaptations of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism have effectively normalized a politically narrowed Zionist fabrication of ethno-religious exceptionalism, racialized as a singular genre of diasporic whiteness that exists alone in its generalized victimhood. In other words, the lexicon of anti-Semitism has become a portable technology of warfare that creates its own theaters of repression, policing, criminalization, and carceral punishment. That is low to high intensity counterinsurgency warfare. This field of lexical warfare projects Palestinian liberation and Palestine solidarity organizers, scholars, artists, and teachers as permanent threats to be neutralized or destroyed by virtue of the conjoined lexicons of anti-Semitism and hate. In the context of ongoing Nakba, lexical counterinsurgency is not reducible to repressive wordplay or insidious definitional expansionism. By the way, I say that because we oftentimes fixate on the notion of anti-Semitism by critiquing how IRA has created this kind of intentionally sloppy expansionist definition. That is a necessary criticism, but I think it is also insufficient. The colonial program, the symbolic order, the political fantasy of Zionism, that is the lexicon of Zionism, is inseparable from the casualties it extracts from Palestinian land and being. Let us think more deeply for just a couple minutes about the origins and implications of this particular form of lexical warfare. IRA's definition of anti-Semitism pivots on a projection of Zionism as an ideological political allegiance universally shared by all Jews across all varieties of Judaism. By the way, also non-Jews, as you heard in the definition. By way of notorious recent example, and Emmaia's book covers this and traces it, conditions of possibility, but notoriously recently, according to Jonathan Greenblatt, the leader of the Anti-Defamation League, quote, every Jewish person is a Zionist. Right? He said this in October 15, 2023 on MSNBC. Here it's also worth noting that one of the founding documents of the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State, written in 1896, explicitly frames Zionism as a secular movement of colonial land conquest that is not premised on universal Jewish participation because he thinks about it as separate from Judaism as a religion. Herzl writes in 1896, quote, Jewish dissidents from the Zionist project must remember that allegiance or opposition is entirely voluntary. He who will not come with us should remain behind, end quote. So that's from one of the founding thinkers of Zionism. So we need to start tracing this understanding and framing how the lexicon forms. Understood in the long historical context of Herzl's formulation of Zionism, the creation of the Israeli nation state in 1948, and ongoing Nakba, IRA's definition of anti-Semitism culturally legitimates multi-institutional, militarized, juridical, and cultural repression of Palestinian resistance and liberation struggle, as well as criminalization and repression of overt criticisms of the Israeli state and Zionism more broadly. Here, I think it is again worth referencing Herzl's foundational articulation of what he called the plan that drives the Zionist movement. Quote, the whole plan is in its essence perfectly simple. Palestine is our ever memorable historic home. The very name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. If His Majesty the Sultan were to give us Palestine, we could in return undertake to regulate the whole finances of Turkey. We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. All right, that's Herzl. As a form of epistemic and para-juridical counterinsurgency against Palestinian existence, lexical warfare by way of this term anti-Semitism echoes the white supremacist, anti-Black, genocidally anti-Indigenous, and patriarchal colonial logics of what Herzl himself identifies as the so-called civilization project. To embrace even a casual familiarity with this history, and Emmaia's book will give us a deep familiarity with this history, But to embrace that history is to begin to understand how the lexicon of anti-Semitism has created new sites, strategies, and tactics of Zionist and pro-Zionist counterinsurgency. Universities, governments, and in the US and other national contexts, presidential administrations and federal legislators continue to build counterinsurgency operations through IHRA's working definition of anti-Semitism. These operations seek to fulfill the military counterinsurgency objective of forestalling and defeating, that is, exterminating, expelling, displacing, criminalizing, and incarcerating whatever organizations, groups of people, and political profiles fit the changing definition of insurgents. Sometimes they call them terrorists, sometimes they call them anarchists, sometimes they call them communists, and you get the point. IHRA's notion of anti-Semitism eliminates the privileged category of the civilian, particularly the Palestinian civilian, by radically expanding the lexical field of enemy combatants to include all who engage in at least 4 different things. First, of course, as I've already mentioned, Palestinian liberation and solidarity activities. 2, enemy combatants include those who engage in critical opposition to the normalization of Israeli occupation, blockading, apartheid, and genocidal to proto-genocidal militarizations, otherwise known as Nakba. Third, those who engage in demystification of the supremacist settler colonial political ideology of Zionism. By the way, just as a scholar, as a teacher, as a thinker, and also as a student, it still blows my mind how much there is a kind of repression of just a basic discussion of what Zionism actually is. Hence the creation of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. Shout out. And then fourth, those who engage in various forms of ideological, intellectual, and analytical opposition to Israeli state and military actions and policies. There are no civilians, right? Anybody who does any of those 4 things, among many other things, is considered to be a combatant in the field of lexical warfare. In this sense, IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism is not merely a weaponization of terms. It is already an activity of warfare and colonial repression in and of itself. The definition institutes a form of what military academics might call asymmetric warfare by identifying targets of elimination and neutralization by virtue of what they are thinking, writing, and saying, as much as by any physical mobilizations. This is why I differentiate the concept of lexical warfare from the more commonly circulated notion of weaponized language. The weaponization of language usually entails tactical, propaganda-based mobilizations of very specific words or phrases for the purpose of extracting specific strategic outcomes. By way of example, when various white supremacists from across the political spectrum, from liberal to reactionary, weaponize the terms of equality, diversity, civil rights, and anti-discrimination to dismantle diversity initiatives in certain institutional settings. That's a weaponization. When right-wing pundits and organizations weaponize the terms of academic freedom or freedom of speech to advance and normalize fascist, neo-Nazi, eugenicist, misogynist, transphobic, Islamophobic, anti-Black, and racist programming in colleges and universities, and of course in various higher education settings of all kinds, that is a form of weaponization. When administrators and many colleagues at the institutions in which a lot of us work, when they weaponize notions of so-called extremism to repress and effectively defame those who articulate rigorous political and intellectual critiques of racist colonial apartheid and anti-Black state and racial capitalist power, that's weaponization. So, while the weaponization of language is a tactical maneuver intended to achieve identifiable immediate strategic objectives, for example, trying to make sure that this event didn't happen, on the other hand, lexical warfare attempts to define and control the conceptual, linguistic, and ideological theaters within which all narrative warfare takes place. Right? I'll repeat the last part. Lexical warfare attempts to define and control the conceptual, linguistic, and ideological theaters within which all narrative warfare takes place. That is a foundational distinction. So then the question becomes, and I'll close here, what happens when the theater of conflict is what the great Black radical feminist cultural theorist Hortense Spillers identifies as the terrain of human and social meaning? We must consider how lexical counterinsurgency warfare seizes and occupies the notions of so-called anti-Semitism and hate such that these keywords effectively define and control the conceptual, ideological, rhetorical, and juridical fields in which certain political struggles take place. While weaponizations of language attempt to attain objectives within already existing theaters of conflict, lexical warfare attempts to define and dominate the theaters of political ideological conflict in and of themselves. Evidence of the momentarily successful counterinsurgency of anti-Semitism and hate as terms surfaces in the ways each of them has come to structure the common lexicon. The fields of assumption, shared knowledge context, and meaning, that is, the epistemic, definitional, and symbolic premises that define the parameters of tolerable, civil, and civilized political and ideological exchange. Lexical warfare is simultaneously a struggle over thought and power, imagination and land, meaning and flesh. It constructs the boundaries of political and cultural conflict through a multifaceted conquest and epistemic occupation of words, definitions, and narratives. So I want to ask us to consider a foundational question as we continue to think and move together. What are the theoretical and strategic implications of counterinsurgency as war in the theater of lexicon? Thank you all for your patience.
Thank you, Dylan, for this wide-ranging talk. And I would encourage everybody to go and visit the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism website, where the talk that you gave at the founding conference, the inaugural conference, which formed the basis for your theorization of Zionism, anti-Semitism as lexical warfare appears. It's really worth revisiting, I think, again and again. One of the things that I took away was also your mentioning of Jonathan Greenblatt's statement that every Jewish person is a Zionist. And of course, by implication, if you are Jewish and you are anti-Zionist, then you are in fact not Jewish. And it's on this basis that Jewish people can then be accused of anti-Semitism by non-Jewish Zionists, which is what we're seeing happening in many places. Right, I would like to now invite Ihab to take the stage. Thank you so much for joining us, Ihab.
Thank you, Alana, and thank you, Maya and Dylan. Okay, this is a very enriching conversation, and I am privileged to be here. To start, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodian of the land in which I live and work. This is a short intervention from me to complement the conversation we are already having. On January this year, Attorney General, this is Australian Attorney General Michelle Rowland, was asked if protests were saying, when they are saying Israel is engaged in genocide or condemning Israel, saying it shouldn't exist, and it led to Jewish Australians feeling harassed or intimidated, they could be banned. She replied, if those criteria are satisfied, then that is the case. According to Professor of Constitutional Law Anne Tomway, this seems to suggest she would consider criticism of Israel as the initial trigger of engaging in a hate crime by inciting racial hatred. Many people criticize the Combating Antisemitism, Hate and Extremism Act on the ground that it may have unintended consequences, including chilling free speech. However, it might be more accurate to say that the chilling consequences are intended. They are actively sought and foreseen outcomes of the bill. The key question is not about the bill as a response to a horrific event, rather the place of the bill in a transformed regime of silencing Palestine, undermining academic freedom, and criminalizing dissent. In the immediate aftermath of October the 7th, Israeli political leaders attempted to mobilize Orientalist framings to legitimize their assault on Gaza. For example, on the 16th of October 2023, Benjamin Netanyahu appealed to the civilizational and epistemic normativity of Orientalism when he claimed This is a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle. However, as the genocide in Gaza unfolds, even after the so-called ceasefire, Israel and its backers have increasingly adopted a more coercive normativity to prop up their Orientalist presuppositions and repress dissent across the globe. According to this new normativity, the law is to outlaw. The academy is an ordeal of civility rather than a passage of discovery. And the legislator is there to decree punitive litigation rather than to foster public deliberation. In this environment, Columbia University sent the police to break the encampment against genocide established by its own students. The UK prescribed Palestine Action Group under terrorism law, and Germany deemed even the call for a ceasefire to be anti-Semitic. In Australia, Universities Australia adopted a definition of anti-Semitism that makes little distinction between protected identity and political ideology. Now, universities in Australia will be subjected to mandatory punitive report card that rates them according to how well they implement this definition. Police encampments and student protest and respond to the display of flags, a formally broad category that includes the fact of Palestinian flags and Palestinian symbols more broadly. These coercive measures are damaging in effect. They undermine the liberal institution of truth, turning it into an institution of authoritarian rule. That is, a policing institution devoted to enforcement, surveillance, and control. Today, in the context of Israel's genocide in Gaza, we are seeing an important shift in the modes through which Palestine and Palestinians are silenced. Traditionally, the silencing of Palestine operated as epistemic violence, that is, as a system of normative knowledge that rendered violence against Palestinians necessary and acceptable. Emmaia Gelman describes this system as compulsory Zionism, that is, a discourse that operates to produce common sense knowledge about the Israel-Palestine question in ways that naturalize and privilege Israel and subjugate Palestinian existence. However, the ability of Palestinians to assert a different standpoint, along with Israel's blatant violence in Gaza, have undermined the interpretive and the normative authority of compulsory Zionism. It is this weakening of the interpretive and normative authority of Zionism that is the condition for what I am calling mandatory Zionism. This Zionism is no longer produced through the circulation of knowledge, norms, and common sense assumptions, but instead relies on institutional, procedural, and administrative enforcement to impose and sanction privilege and hierarchies that render Zionist ideology a protected identity while legitimizing Palestinian voices. While compulsion from the Old Latin compeller, to drive, to force, is defined by Oxford Dictionary as the action or an act of compelling or the condition of being compelled. Mandatory from Latin, mandatum, something commanded, refers explicitly to a command. We, as witnesses of Israel's genocide in Gaza, are now no longer simply compelled to silence by the force of epistemic hierarchies. We are now commanded to be silent by envoys, administrators, and police officers. As such, mandatory Zionism is a turning point. It signals a wholesale adoption of authoritarian prerogatives that police language, restrict protest, and curtail academic freedom. To speak of mandatory Zionism is to invoke the mandate system established by the League of Nations to govern peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world. Ever since Palestine became a mandate run by the British, Palestinians themselves have encountered Zionism as imperial command. The British mandate enforced the Zionist project by repressing Palestinians and imposing draconian laws and regulations that protected underprivileged settlers. Israel subsequently incorporated mandatory law into its own domestic law and uses to repress the remaining Palestinians under its own jurisdiction. In effect, mandatory law prefigured the forked nature of the Jewish state, in which an incidental citizenship is given to Arabs who happen to remain in Israel after the Nakba, and essential citizenship given to Jews as Jews. Similarly, mandatory Zionism forked the institution of the liberal truth between those who have governing rights and opinions and those who are governed and censored. It promises security and prosperity for some while simultaneously condemning others to precarious status. Mandatory Zionism, in alliance with the New Right, takes aim at the institutional pockets that hosted critical theory in the past few decades. The attack on critical race theory and settler colonial studies are just two examples of the attempt to legitimize theories that unpack relations and the structure of power. If these theories are distinguished themselves as form of thoughts that think their own condition as they think the human condition, mandatory Zionism is anti-theory, that is anti-thinking. So what is at stake in the legislation that's been introduced in January is this fact that we are moving from a regime in which compulsory Zionism operated. We still have, as Dylan said, a theater in which language operate as a space of conflict. However, there is increased insecurity that there is a need for administrative, legalized procedural matters that target us institutionally in our space. And of course, using the language of hate to evade any structural questions. So to me, right now, this is a new phase in the shaping of the institutions of liberal truth in general. The university is one of them. The legislative is the other one. And the public space, the liberal public space, also being increasingly operate according to mandatory Zionism. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ihab. I wanted to say also, in relation to what you said, Ihab, I think you made an extremely important point by connecting mandatory Zionism to the attack on things like critical race theory and gender studies, which I wrote about actually in my last book. And I wanted to just mention that we have both Emmaia, yourself, and Dylan, who thought about this extensively. I mean, I consulted Dylan and other members of the Institute's working group on critical ethnic studies on the whole history of the attack on critical ethnic studies by Zionists, which goes back several decades, actually, particularly in California, where Dylan is located, but also more generally across the United States. And I think for those of us who are involved in scholarship or public education, we need to be thinking very critically about these things, because the knock-on effect for all of our scholarship and our teaching, which administrators have declared that they're going to be scrutinizing in the aim of enforcing mandatory Zionism, is something that's going to be coming down the line, or has already come down the line for many of us, which has all kinds of implications for what we can actually do in the classroom and what kind of classroom we're going to have in the future, one that's, constructed in the aims of maintaining the contours, the disciplinary contours of mandatory Zionism. And I wanted to also say that just to return this also to the point made by Emmaia about recruiting liberals for fascism. I mean, this is a very important and critical point, because of course, when we equate racism with hate, and as you made the point there, Emmaia, equating attacks of very different kinds against completely different kinds of people with each other, means that the primary victims of this kind of legislation that we're now going to face, and we have historical evidence for this, are not going to be the people who actually face the brunt of everyday racist violence at the hands of the state and also of white supremacists. I mean, an example that I cited in an article that I co-wrote actually on the issue, if you remember that, of Sam Kerr being accused of anti-white racism, which he was eventually acquitted from. Francis Awer-Otefe and myself wrote an article in The Guardian in which we recalled the fact that when legislation against racial vilification was introduced in Western Australia, the first person to be charged under it was an Aboriginal teenager who called a white woman a slur. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with. We already have evidence for this, and now it's being rolled out on a mass scale. And then, of course, this leads straight away, because you've equated racism with hate, to anti-racists being accused of racism, which is basically what we're being accused of by people who want to have carte blanche to defend a genocidal regime. Okay, so thank you all. We have some questions in the chat, which I'm going to read out. All right. Oh, there's quite a few. Okay, so we've got one from Jesse, who asks, what have been the most successful strategies for resisting IRA? Are there good resources showing how it has been weaponized? Although, Dylan, you problematized the idea of weaponization. Other than, I think this is IJV, is that Independent Jewish Voices? I'm not sure who that stands for in Canada. Who'd like to take that one? Maybe Emmaia or Dylan, I'm not sure. Oh, yes. Sorry, I have to unmute because we have a regime here. There we go.
Thank you.
I'm going to unmute everybody.
What have been the most successful strategies for resisting IRA? That's such a good question. It depends on the contexts, and there are, I mean, one of the features of Zionist attack, including its attack through IRA, is just like trying everything and seeing what sticks. It doesn't have to be logically, it doesn't have to have like follow an internal logic. So, IRA is one thing that gets proposed. Another is like protect Zionist as an identity. Another one is like, we're just trying to have dialogue here. One thing that I'll answer part of your question first. Have there been good resources showing how it's been weaponized other than IJV's report, which is great? In the US, there is a recent report that was co-produced by the Middle East Studies Association and the American Association of University Professors on how civil rights law has been used to attack and silence. And the basis of the use of civil rights, it's Title VI in US civil rights law. And the basis of the use of Title VI is often the IRA definition. Whether or not it's articulated as the IRA definition, it's just used. And that's actually one thing that we've also encountered is that, and probably everyone has, that where we have been able to push back on the IRA definition and say, like, look, 500 Holocaust and genocide scholars say that the IRA definition is not credible. And, that what happens is that institutions then say, well, we're not going to adopt the IRA definition, but then they just do, right? Like they just operationalize it, even if it's not adopted. So that's partly a way of setting up what there is to resist. And then how has it been resisted? One thing that we've found in sort of looking broadly at how this stuff is working is that anywhere that there's a democratic process, that Zionist repression fails. So anywhere, like, for example, the National Education Association, which is the 3 million person teachers union in the United States, passed a a business item saying that they didn't want to work with the Anti-Defamation League anymore. Now, that's not the same as rejecting the IRA definition, but it's kind of a stand-in. And they did that with a member, like a delegate vote, 7,000 people on the floor of their convention by voice vote. That decision was overturned because the executive committee circumvented the democratic process. But that's emblematic. Anywhere there's a democratic process, anywhere you can insist on a democratic process, that kind of the IRA definition, Zionist policy, those kinds of forms of repression fail. The other way that it's been successful, more to a certain extent in the U.S. and more in the UK, is in the courts, actually, because it's just such a violation of so many rights. It's a violation of free speech. It's a violation of academic freedom. It's a violation of Jewish self-expression. There are lots of ways that it's a violation. But in order to resist IRA, you either have to sort of make it impossible because the entities that are often making the decisions are not acting in good faith, right? So, so how do you resist it? I don't know. You have to do a flanking motion and overcome the forces that are trying to implement it.
Yeah, thank you.
I think
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, Emmaia nailed it. All I was gonna just add to complement what Emmaia just said is the moments where I've found real traction in not just resisting the IRA definition, but also kind of exposing and gutting it, you know what I mean, to the point where it's no longer coherent or feasible, are when people and collectives realize that what they're fighting is actually not a definition, right? They let go of that part. It's not they're not engaged in an academic struggle, they're not engaged in a kind of dictionary-based definitional struggle. What they're actually engaged in is a necessarily militant form of resistance against a political program. It's a political program. It's not a word. It's not. That's why it's war. It's ideological and institutional counterinsurgency that they are resisting, not the definition of anti-Semitism. Right? The definition of anti-Semitism is a lexical proxy for the forms of evisceration, obliteration that we're talking about. And I'll just say, and Emmaia kind of was touching on this, to kind of make those, to stake those arguments. To stake arguments that try to resist the normalization of IRA's definition of anti-Semitism around definitional disputes, by contrast, never go anywhere. You know what I mean? They never go anywhere because Zionists and pro-Zionists don't care. They make it pretty evident. They don't care whether the definition is sloppy, sound, historically grounded, contradictory, or not. Right? So I think that's all I would add to what Emmaia said.
Wait, okay, so now I just have to add one more thing, which is we have started to realize, actually, it was the encampments that really raised Zionism as the sort of problematic, right? Like, they're like, stop talking about pro-Israel or anti-Israel. Stop, it's Zionism is the problem. And if we can elevate that and confront it, then those kinds of slippages where it's like, oh, we're talking about IRA, we're not talking about IRA, are no longer powerful.
Yeah, we still have a lot of questions in the chat. And one of the questions, the next one, in fact, from Matt Serif Kalik, who's a brilliant writer who's written an article in the latest issue of the Institute's journal. But I think your question will probably take a little bit more time to answer, but I encourage people to read it. I will say, just in relation to the last comments made by Dylan and Emmaia, and it relates to your question, Matt, that the final chapter of my book, The New Racial Regime, actually argues against definitions. And what I mean by that is that any attempt to incorporate, to ask institutions to incorporate definitions of, be it anti-Semitism or other forms of racism, including anti-Palestinian racism, that we think should be, are better definitions or more expansive, is a losing game, because you haven't understood the terrain of lexical warfare that Dylan maps out for us. So in terms of just briefly answering your question, I mean, I very much rely on Dylan's analysis in order to build my own, which does slightly different but connected work. I want to turn to some of the questions that are maybe a bit more practical in terms of the situation that we're facing. And I think that the next question from Eddie is something that even our guests who aren't familiar with the local context can answer to, because I think it's a generalized question. And they wrote, do any of the speakers have any comment on the recent announcement by Creative Australia's director, which is the federal arts funding body, that it will be supporting projects that enhance social cohesion, in inverted commas, in relation to weaponization of language? How do they predict this playing out in creative practice? Obviously, we know that social cohesion is a term, or community cohesion, as it was conceived in the British context, is a term that was sort of rolled out in the context of the global war on terror and the backlash against multiculturalism of the mid-2000s. So does anybody have a comment on this one?
Look, I will have a go. Thank you. It is clear, okay, just social cohesion is from the linguistic theater that we are discussing here, and it also intersect with what I'm talking about in terms of mandatory Zionism. It is introducing a range of procedures, okay, to institutions, okay, just like Creative Australia here, to tell artists who are in very precarious position, there are certain things that you could talk about and other things you can't talk about. If you want to be an artist, this is an existential question. And eke some existence by having, okay, just a project funded once a year. You need to follow a certain prescription of what we mean by social cohesion. Like, if you look at the description or the real commission on anti-Semitism and social cohesion, it is not clear, okay, what they mean by social cohesion to the communities. There is definition of social cohesion in brackets and saying it is the rule of law, democracy, and something else. So it is mainly about, okay, just being an obedient citizen to a certain rule of law. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but this is a coercive measure to say to people, okay, just you have a choice, and a choice to abstain from talking about certain issues.
I'll add to that any term that is vague, we know this from all kinds of anti-racist organizing, right? Any term that's vague, anything that leaves the interpretation to a government body, in a colonial government to interpret, is just used as a weapon. So it doesn't mean anything. We don't know what it means, and they'll tell you what it means when you apply for your project on Palestine. The other thing is that there is in the US, and probably I'm assuming elsewhere, a real push right now by right-wing funders and political strategists to fund programs in dialogue and civility. And this just, sort of smacks of exactly the same thing. So when you have a funding body, I mean, I don't know what the sources of funding are, but it seems likely to me that that those two things mesh, right? Like somebody gets a grant for an arts project in social cohesion, and here's an institution that has dialogue funding, right-wing dialogue funding, that's going to match with it. So it seems to be part of a machinery.
We have a question from Caradine Hannon, which I'll read, but I'm just wary of the fact that we don't have Kieran with us. So we don't have any Indigenous representation, unfortunately, on the panel because Kieran Stewart Asherton couldn't make it. But I do think it's an important point, so I want to read it out. They say, in terms of mandatory Zionism in settler colonies, it seems that Indigenous cultural erasure is at its core. Increasingly, First Nations epistemologies are being erased as violence against Indigenous people escalates. How can people begin to understand how important Aboriginal leadership is in resistance movements that seem to get derailed by careerism and photo ops, etc., and how resisting the IRA definition is crucial? I mean, I do want to comment that what I wanted Kieran to speak about, what he agreed to speak about, was after the terrorist attack, as it was named, at Boorloo on Invasion Day, there was a call coming from the organizers of the Invasion Day protest to name it a hate crime. And I think the aim of that was to juxtapose it and, to start in stark kind of opposition to the way in which anti-Semitism, including much more minor incidents of anti-Semitism or alleged anti-Semitism, were being framed as hate crimes and taking precedence. And while that can be appreciated, I think he was going to mobilize critiques of the insufficiencies of that go along the lines of all the things that have been said in the context of this webinar. So I think I'll leave it there, but I think it was really important to note. I might move on to Priya's question. They say, It's about the way we've seen an acceleration in a framing of the language of racism and anti-racism to mystify conversations about Palestine in this moment of mandatory Zionism. It seems to be adding further injury to the insult of liberal diversity, equity, and inclusion. To what extent can racism and anti-racism be wrested back for radical purposes? Does anybody want to take that one?
That seems like a Dylan.
Yeah.
I mean, two quick immediate things that spin the gears in my head when I think about this point. First of all, thank you for that question. It's really important, incisive, and grounded. Especially when we think, I have my oldest kid is a senior at Dartmouth College, which is arguably one of the major points of innovation for the creation of these like kind of dialogues of equilibration between asymmetrical positions, one of which is genocidal, the other one of which is liberationist, is trying to, at this point, survive genocide, and creating a safe space to equilibrate and flatten, those fundamentally incommensurate positions. So it actually is maddening to watch that happen at an institutional scale, and then for that to then become a platform or a kind of blueprint to circulate widely. And I think that Priya's point here needs to be taken very seriously because primary to that blueprinting of equilibration between asymmetric positions is the language of discrimination, racism, anti-racism, and rights. Okay, and like in its various interpretations. So I have two responses. One is that, and Joy James said this in 1994, 1995, something like that, right? It's in her book, Resisting State Violence. She said that, and I'm paraphrasing, but what she's warned us about is how any critical discourse on racism runs the risk of falling back into liberalism if we sever racism from its logical culmination, and I would argue its immediate culmination, in genocide. Right? Racism is inherently a genocidal and proto-genocidal logic. To whatever extent an institution or a discourse thinks about racism as something other than that, then we need to reject the premise and bring in. And by the way, we don't have to use the word genocide. We could use the word Nakba. We could use other kinds of terms, right? I'm just using genocide because it's legible to people here. So I think that's one point, right? It's like question the premise through which these terms get introduced. This is part of engaging in lexical counter warfare, by the way. You know what I mean? Like we exist in this kind of symbolic universe. We actually need to take militant positions in how we inhabit the lexicon. So that's one, reject the premise, okay? And then the one, anti-racism, right? So anti-racism, we can think about how anti-racism then also gets severed from liberationist praxis, right? You can engage in anti-racism, which is actually anti-liberationist, to the extent that it's a massaging of a colonial and civilizational regime, apparatus, or state. Let's engage in a vigorous collective anti-racist movement that will recalibrate, renormalize, and vindicate a colonial apartheid genocidal state, as opposed to supporting liberationist struggle, right? Liberationist struggle in which anti-racism it's not even a kind of purpose, it's a given, right? Anti-racism is the epistemic and ideological condition of possibility for the liberation struggle and not an objective. So I think those are so I think we actually need to take the grounding of this question that Priya raises seriously, which is to engage in a counter war, like a lexical counter war, to question the premises, reject them when they need to be rejected, and then pose alternative terms that are more serious, and that, frankly, that will fracture the assumption of a unity of understanding of what these terms mean. I think that is a highly productive political work, right? To fracture the assumption that we have some kind of unanimity or even consensus around what these words mean, what their implications are.
100%. And I just wanted to add, in the context of all of this, there's going to be all kinds of quote unquote opportunities coming down the line for people in the so-called third sector, the academic realm, for funding for projects that meet the needs of mandatory Zionism, as Ihab has laid it out for us, around issues of social cohesion, hate crimes, extremism, and all the rest of it. And I think we need to be very, very wary of the idea that we can work within the system in order to change something from within, which is a viewpoint that we've heard, and that, in this economy of scarcity, with a generalized attack on our entire sectors, there is going to be participation in these quote unquote opportunities, and I think we need to be highly vigilant and resistant against them. That's my personal view. We have time for one last question, which is more of a historical one. It's to Ihab from Ronit, and she says, I was interested in your link between the British mandate and mandatory Zionism. Can you elaborate? And would you say that the British laid the ground to mandatory Zionism?
Look, thank you. This I need to flesh this more. Look, compulsory Zionism, which I would say roughly operated from the 1970s till more recently, operated within an imagination of politics in which hegemony, in Gramscian terms, between consent and coercion, operated. So there was a process of negotiation. However, colonial projects did not operate as the Indian theorist and historian Ranjit Kawa said, according to the logic of hegemony. It operated to the logic of dominance. So he talks about hegemony, dominance without hegemony. So one thing that, okay, just mandatory, so when the British ran the mandate in Palestine, did not think in terms of establishing hegemony over Palestinians. They thought in terms of establishing dominance over them and used legal infrastructures and structures to impose dominance. I think we are going back, or not going back, we are going to a new phase of dominance without hegemony. Yeah. And in this case, dominance without hegemony speak to the conditions of the moment in which imperial powers are saying, okay, just there are no space to consider this notion of consent and combining consent and coercion. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think it is the difference between about the dominance without hegemony.
Okay, thank you so much. There is another question here. I would like to ask the thoughts of speakers in relation to the overt push by Zionist organizations to influence local government sector in Australia, as evidenced by the Australian Mayor's Summit Against Antisemitism. This is something possibly that Emmaia and Dylan, you don't know about directly, but maybe Ihab, you have thoughts on, or you could imagine what this is about, I am sure. This was
actually going to
sorry?
I'm going to put an article in the chat that that just sort of touches on it. So the Combat Antisemitism movement comes out of Kansas oil money in the United States, and they've been doing this like mayoral summits for a couple of years now. So if they started in the United States, I think they expanded to Europe, and now it seems they've reached Australia. And it's not entirely clear. I mean, the materials that I have seen from the summits are, just sort of standard stuff. More, it seems to me, about relationship building. And so on the one hand, it's ominous because it's an expansion of their reach. And on the other hand, my guess is that it's just doubling down on what already exists. But I think that the tool for responding to that, similar to what Dylan was saying, is the way to sort of push back on it, expose what's happening, is to look at who's sponsoring it, like to actually expose the organizations themselves and show what their other projects are, right? So the Combat Antisemitism movement is like anti-woke. They're super identifiable as a right-wing organization. They do all this anti-woke stuff.
Alana, if I could add for the local context, okay. One thing is about we need to be careful about local governments, that it is staffed by people who are aspiring to move to state and federal governments, and in this case, okay, just this engagement, okay, at an early stage is the engagement with people who think, okay, look, this is the way if I want to continue in politics, okay, to be just part of this agenda. So while local governments might not do much in this area, it is for people who are who have aspiration of social mobility and political mobility in the political system, and this is why it is dangerous.
My dad, I think this is why it's very important to try to mobilize in the local area, because a lot of our activism has moved online. And I think many people have drawn attention to the limitations of that when it actually comes to having influence in these kinds of local politics, because it's also about who is elected. A comment. Did you want me to unmute you very briefly so that you can make it, or do you want to put it in the chat? Can, if you want.
I think it is in the chat.
Okay.
I would add to that, just like we do see that, that is a thing, like Zionist organizations create these events that people have to attend, right? They don't have they don't have any choice. But I think that even though people do it like without really meaning to participate any further, like they do build a network that creates, additional pressure. I don't know. The networks are there anyway, but it is ominous.
Okay, if you want to briefly say something, unmute yourself.
Yep. All right now?
Yep.
Okay. Really briefly, thank you for letting me make a comment. This conference, all expenses paid, blah, 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 huge conflicts of interest in terms of, the people that were sponsoring it, development applications, blah, blah, blah. What they were pushing at that conference was that they are wanting local governments to adopt the IHRA definition within council. The other thing that they were doing was they had this whole propaganda book of symbols that they didn't want councils to use and everything like that. They ran workshops on it. It was extremely overt attempt to manipulate local government politics. And yes, I think if you put up a conference saying Mayor's Summit against anti-Semitism, a lot of good people in local government will go, oh, okay, that sounds all right, and go along. It was absolutely about building, I think, quite a dangerous and pervasive network within local government. And that is absolutely something that I think we should be concerned about. Anyway, that's my 5 cents worth.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think what this goes to show is that the issues that we're concerned with go across a whole swathe of sectors, and we need to be extremely vigilant. And unfortunately, we're going to have to draw our discussion to a close, but I really hope that it's deepened your understanding conceptually of the problems that surround the context for the act that is now being enforced. That was the aim of today. There's so much background and history and theory that goes into this. And as Ihab said, there's so much effort on the other side to attack thinking that we need to be engaging in more, not less thinking. Very briefly, before I thank our speakers, I've put 2 links in the chat to mutual aid fundraisers. One is for families in Gaza that I've been involved in. There's a group of families that a group of us in so-called Australia have been raising money for the last year or so. And then there's also a link to the Black People's Union Community Solidarity Fund. So I'd encourage you to click on those links and make a donation. Even $5, every little bit counts. Thank you so much. So I'm going to end by thanking our speakers, Ihab, Emmaia, and Dylan, for your powerful words today and your analysis. It's been so important. And I hope that this is the start of many more occasions to hear about the work of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism here in so-called Australia. I welcome you to follow our website and our socials to get to know more about what it is that we do. So thank you all very much for coming, and yes, more soon. Thank you.